I'm Amy Harrington. It's September 28th, 2012, and I'm interviewing Fred Willard on behalf of the Archive of American Television in Encino, California. So we are ready whenever you are.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So we're going to start with just about 10 minutes of background information before we get into your career.
Oh.
So what was your name at birth?
My name at birth?
Yes.
Frederick Charles Willard.
And where and when were you born?
I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm pretty sure it's Cleveland, Ohio. September 18th, 1939.
And where did you grow up?
Shaker Heights, Ohio.
And what were your parents' names and what did they do for a living?
My father's name was also Frederick Willard, spelled a little different than mine. My mother's name was Ruth. Her maiden name was Weinman, W-E-I-N-M-A-N. And I'm a little vague as to what my father did for a living. I just know he got up every day, got dressed up, went downtown. I think he worked for a financial institution, did something about financing and cars. But when you're little, you really don't know exactly what your father did.
Right. And did your mother work?
No. My mother was just a housewife. And my father died quite young. And I was, I think, about 12 years old when he died. So that was kind of tough.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. Did you feel like you inherited any traits from your parents?
I don't really remember. My mother had a pretty good, she had kind of a cynical sense of humor. And we lived in Cleveland, and that's kind of part of the country that doesn't really fall for anything too fancy, anything too current. One of my mother's favorite expressions was, boy, what you don't see when you haven't got a gun. If she saw anyone dressed strangely or doing something strangely. I got a lot of my humor from my aunts and uncles. They were all very jolly and very funny. And when they would come over to our house, I would just laugh all the time. They would just do little naughty things. And I think they were a little younger. This is on my mother's side. They were just a little younger and a little more fun. As a matter of fact, my one uncle, Bob, was not that much older than me. And my mother used to call me occasionally, say, Bob, because she'd lived through him being young. Now he was in his 20s, but I was a little boy, so she'd kind of get us confused. But I always looked forward to them coming over. They were very funny.
Did you feel like you had a sense of humor when you were little?
I think I did. And I think I was kind of the class clown in grade school. I was kind of disruptive. I'd make people laugh. I don't know why. I don't know where that came from. But I remember one time my teacher I said something, and the whole class laughed, and my teacher got very mad. And I said, that's not my fault. You wouldn't be mad if they hadn't laughed. But I did always have kind of a good sense of humor. I wasn't over the top. I wasn't zany. I didn't break things or throw things. But I was just always had a bit of a sense of humor.
Were you interested in performing? Was that did
I was not interested in performing. I always wanted to be a baseball player. And I think I did enjoy performing because I remember in grade school I wrote a sketch for our show. We had a variety show. I did a scene from an old children's book called Ferdinand the Bull. And then I remember writing a sketch called The Mystery of the Missing Key. It was a play on the word of a key and a piano key. I couldn't tell you what it was about. But my one of my friends, who also had a good sense of humor, wrote a sketch called Crazy Camp. And he said to me, of course we spell it with a K. And I thought that was so insightful that he would spell Crazy Camp with a K. And that was kind of a cutting-edge sense of humor back then. Because you'd always see the cartoons, they'd spell, crazy with a K or cat with a K. So we're doing a spoof on people trying to be funny.
And did you perform those at school?
Oh
or
yeah, I performed them. I was in the shows. I was kind of a ham. I always liked to get up in front of people and perform.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
No brothers and sisters.
Okay. So did you watch a lot of TV when you were growing up?
No, it was more radio. I was kind of a radio generation. The whole thing with Tom Mix and Lone Ranger. And then I remember Lux Radio Theater, I seem to remember. They would recreate movies on radio. And I always thought, even as a kid, I said, boy, that's a good job to be a movie actor and do a radio show. Because I knew then that radio, you just read the scripts. And I thought that'd be a good, easy job. And I was always amused when they would do a radio show. And it was supposed to be done on the stage. You know, welcome, Mr. First Nighter. There's a show that had something like that. Welcome, Mr. First Nighter. The curtain is about to go up on our show. And the curtain would go up, and they'd be in a train station, and they'd get on a train, and the train would start traveling. And I thought, how could they be doing this on stage? The train would travel over the countryside and come into another station. And, you know, they could do it on radio, but I guess they figured that the audience would never put it together that on a stage you couldn't do this.
Right. Do you remember the first time you saw TV?
Oh boy. It was a long time. I was well, I remember seeing Twilight Zones. I never had a TV. We got married. My wife and I lived in some cheap hotel in New York. And I had auditioned for a TV movie about a semi-professional football player. And I had called my agent. I said, I'd love to play this role. And I got to New York. I was going to Chicago to do something for Second City. And I asked my agent about it. And he said, you know, it's funny you asked. They're still looking for this character. So I went over and I auditioned. And I did a wonderful job. It was a TV movie about a semi-pro football player, and I was really into sports at the time. And then I went on to Chicago. I was doing a show, a Second City show. And the second day of rehearsal, the stage manager came in and said, Fred, your agent's on the phone. I said, oh boy, I got the part. And I said, Irvin, how are you? He said, hi, how's it going? I said, great, great. I said, what's happening? He says, would you like to be on The Dating Game? I said, what? He said, The Dating Game. I said, yeah, I guess. What happened to that movie? He said, oh, they gave it, and he told me some name. Some other guy got it. So I came back. I went on The Dating Game. And then when the show came on, my wife and I were living in this little hotel. We didn't even have a TV. So I went down to the front desk, and I said, could we rent a TV for one night? It was an old black and white TV. And honest to God, we had the clothes hanger on it. And I watched the show, and the guy who did it was good, and I was so jealous of him. But he passed away unexpectedly a few years later, and I said, boy, that's a good thing. Never be jealous of someone who gets a part that you have. And then I kept going down to the front desk saying, you know, we're done with the TV, because I thought they were going to charge us, you know, a couple of dollars a day. And the guy must have been very friendly. He never came and picked up the TV and just let us have the TV. And then I remember we moved into a nicer apartment. And we got our first TV, and we watched every night because it was a good picture. And suddenly, for about 6 months, we watched everything because we were finally catching up with television. My wife had never been that much of a TV fan either, and I hadn't really got into the early TV just because I hadn't been around it. And I missed a lot of good stuff, which I have since seen and become a great fan of, like the Phil Silver Show. And then I was on a lot of, I don't know how early it was, but I had a partner, a comedy team, and I think one of our first shows was the Steve Allen Show. And we did a bunch of those, and I remember being in San Francisco. We were working in a club called The Hungry Eye, and our first Steve Allen show was on. And I walked down the street to a a bar, and I went in and they had some program on, and I asked the bartender, I said, could you turn on the Steve Allen Show? And, yeah, okay, yeah. Anyone mind if we turn on the Steve Allen Show? Turned on the Steve Allen Show, and there was our sketch on. And I watched it, and the bartender, no one recognized me, but that's the first time I saw myself on national TV.
Wow. So tell me about your comedy act and your partner. What was his name?
His name was Vic Greco. His real name was Gus Masserino, but in those days, guys would change their names. So Vic Greco, and I had gotten to New York and didn't know what I wanted to do. I realized I was not going to be a big league baseball player, which didn't bother me, but I would like to have been a professional baseball player, just to play a couple of years, get out every day and play. So I said, what could I do? Let's see, maybe I'll be a disc jockey, because I had this fantasy about getting on the radio and breaking new records. Here's a new record, and then maybe playing the original version of it and someone else's version of it. But I realized I was too late. It was now corporate, so they had the company would have the top 20, the top 40, whatever it is. So then I said, maybe I'll be an actor. That would be fun. So I started going around to different acting schools to just inquire about them. And I was 23 years old, so I was really ready to go. And most of the schools had scene study and, acting like a tree and acting like a dog and sense memory. And I'd ask them all, do you have showcases? And they'd say, oh, no, we don't perform in front of audiences. And I said, well, geez. So I finally saw a place called Showcase Theater. It was up on West 58th or 59th Street. This couple had built a little theater in their apartment. And I went in, and they said, everyone was darling. What we do, we work on scenes, and every 10 weeks we have a showcase. And we invite talent scouts, and we have several professional actor friends. And I said, boy, that's what I want. So I went in, and at the time, everything was Tennessee Williams and things like that, and Golden Boy and scenes like that. And you'd work on the scene. And the male teacher, the husband, would drive me nuts because you'd memorize the scene, and you'd sit down on the stage, and you'd get out one line, and he'd stop you. Okay, have some business. And he had a lock of hair come over his hair. And all right, what you need is some business now. Come in and do, and you should be busy. And I wanted to say, Jesus, let me just get through the scene once. But we would do the scenes, and finally, it was the best experience you could have, because finally it was out of his hands. You would do the scene, and you would have the showcase night, and he would invite, they would invite a few casting people to come. And it was in their living room, so they'd seat about 30, 40 people. And I did a scene, I forget it was, and I walked off stage, and I heard a voice say, who was that young man in the scene? Oh, that was Fred Willard. He's a new student. So afterwards, they came back, and I think they were a little annoyed. Mr. Saunders, he's from 20th Century Fox. He would like you to come down and talk to him tomorrow. So I thought, oh my God, this is wonderful. So I went down. I remember that I'd only been in New York less than a year, and I walked down 58th or 59th to 20th Century Fox, and going through my head, I was thinking, now he's going to want me to go to Hollywood, but I don't know whether I should. I just got to New York. I have a day job. I'm doing the show. So I got in, and Mr. Saunders, I believe that was his name, said, Fred, I really enjoyed your scene last night. Thank you. Tell me about yourself. I told him a little about myself. He says, let me have your photo. He says, now, next time you're doing something, let me know, and I'd like to see it. I said, oh, all right. And that was it. I left and walked back up to where I was staying. And I think he came to another show, and I was doing a scene with a young lady, and he called us both in. And he had us redo the scene, and he called one of his superiors in. And again, we did the scene, and they said, good, if you're doing anything, let us know. But meanwhile, it was the best experience ever doing this showcase, because you were in front of an audience, and you could feel if you were being real and true. And meanwhile, this friend of mine, his name was Vic Greco, he had a very good sense of humor, and we joked around. And we had a lot of fun. We saw an ad in the trades one day. It says, actors needed for sketch comedy show. So we went down to this rehearsal hall, and they were having, there's a group of comics. And we walked in, and we kind of interrupted the meeting, and the fellow in charge said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Well, we're here. You had an ad for actors for sketch comedy review." He says, "Do you have your own material?" And we said, "No." He said, "Well, write a sketch or two and come back." So every week we would write a sketch and come back and perform it. And after about 8 or 9 weeks, the guy loved our material so much, he said, "We're going to do away with our sketch. We're just going to do a show of your material." So we did our show. I think it was very funny. It was just sketches. And eventually we started getting jobs in the village. This was the day of the coffee houses down in the village, the phase 2, the bitter end, the gaslight. And we would get up on a Friday and Saturday and do our sketches. And we got a pretty good response. I think we got written up in the New York Magazine or the New Yorker or something. And eventually we got a manager and an agent, and we got booked on the Ed Sullivan Show. And we got booked on Mike Douglas and the Tonight Show. We did several Tonight shows, and did a tour of different coffee houses around the country. And we were known as Greco and Willard. And then we were going to be regulars on the Carol Burnett Show. She had a variety show. And something happened. My partner decided he wanted to go out on his own. And this kind of threw me. I said, they want us to be on the Carol Burnett Show. And our manager was upset. He said, "This could be a great thing." It was Tim Conway and
Harvey Korman.
And all. So to make a long story short, he decided he wanted to go out on his own. And then my manager called me and he said, "Now Vic has decided he'd like to get another partner and do this Carol Burnett Show. Would you have any objection to that?" I said, "Yeah, I kind of would." He said, "Well, why?" I said, "Well, I wrote all this material, pretty much of it. Not to belittle him, he was very funny, and he added color to the sketches, and he would make me laugh the hardest." And he said, "Well, if you want to, why don't you get another partner and audition, and they'll choose which one they're going to use." Now, I knew in my mind, if 2 different people, if a team breaks up and they each come in with a different partner, they don't want to touch this. But I wasn't going to let him go on and do this show. So I came up, we got another partner, and of course we didn't get on the Carol Burnett Show. But my other partner and I worked a bit in the village. Then my agent wanted to see him. He said, "I want to see your new act." And this guy didn't want my agent to see our new act for some reason. And I said, "Well, Bobby, he's got to see it or he can't book it." So meanwhile, I teamed up with a third guy. And then I got a call from my agent. He said, "Second City is in New York casting." And I'd seen Second City when they came through with their big show with Alan Arkin and all these wonderful people. And I said, "I can't do that. They're all doing political material and stuff about psychiatrists and philosophers." And they said, "Well, they'd seen me and my first partner at Mr. Kelly's in the Gate of Horn in Chicago, and they thought I'd be a good addition." So I said, "Well, okay, I've never improvised." So I went down. It was at William Morris, and we went into a room. There were about 30 of us. One of the other actors was Robert Klein. And we sat there, and they talked about Second City. They said, "We're going to get each of you up and do an improv scene." I said, "Oh, dear." So they got me and someone else up, and the subject happened to be a coffee house. And you're waiting to go on, and there's a folk singer on, and this is right in my area there. So I got up, and all this stuff came out. It was quite funny, and I sat down. And other people got up, and I got up to do a second one, and I started to get a little confidence. And by the end of the hour, they said, "Okay, we have time for maybe one more." And I was like this, let me. So I got up, and I did it. And I think I did a sketch with Robert Klein. He was one of the funniest guys I'd ever seen at the time. I'd never seen anyone this funny. And then they called me, and they said, "We'd like you to come to Chicago to be in Second City." And I said, well, I'm doing some things here now, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, we'd really like you. What we'll do, we'll hold the spot open for a week. But after that, we'll have to fire get someone else. So I went home and I called a woman named Barbara who had a bookstore called Barbara's Bookstore, which is still very popular in Chicago. She was very important in Chicago. I said, Barbara, is Second City still hip and well respected? She said, oh, yes. So I called her back. I said, okay, I will come to Chicago for 6 months to be in Second City. And I hated it because I had to move out of New York. I was very comfortable. I was going to be in an off-Broadway show or Broadway, who knows. So I went to Chicago and I did 6 months there. And David Steinberg was in the troupe, and a lady named Judy Grobart. And it was my first time improvising, and I kind of took to it because when you got up every night, you kind of lower that barrier you have in your head, say, is this going to be stupid if I do this? And I was really having fun. And at the end of the 6 months, they said, Fred, we'd like to hold you over for another 6 months. And I said, oh. So I hemmed and hawed, and finally I said, okay, I'll stay another 6 months. And then I went to Sheldon Patinkin, who was our director, and he's was very instrumental at the Second City. And I went up to him, I said, Sheldon, should I have asked for more money? And he said, no. So I said, okay. So there I was. I spent a year at Second City. Now they spend 6, 7, 8 years, but I was just in and out in 1 year. And it was about the best experience of my life.
Why?
Because you would spend the day, you'd think of something during the day. Say, that'd be a funny idea. I would come in at night to the dressing room. I say, I have a great idea for a sketch for our improv set. I said, I'll be walking down the street. There'll be a panhandler. And I would say to Bob Klein, I said, Bob, you be the panhandler. Judy, you'll be the lady who comes up. You're going to sing a song. So every night when I would come in, Bob Klein would say, Willard, you casting tonight? So I just had great fun. And we spent 1 or 2 days learning all the original Second City sketches, the really classic ones. And I told them, I said, this is about the best day of my life, because they were going to film them for some TV talk show that was on in New York. And every night for a week, they were going to show a classic Second City a scene. And I looked forward to that. And at the last minute, they changed their mind. And every night ran a special about some horse show that was appearing in New York. So they never showed what we did. And I'd love to see some of those things on tape. So we eventually came to, the company moved to New York for a month or two. We played at a place called The Bottom Line in New York. And the show ended, and I was unemployed. And I teamed up again with my original partner. For a while, we toured around again, and then broke up a second time, and then I started to get calls for different shows.
Well, let me interrupt, if you
Yes.
don't mind, and ask you a few things that you did do.
Oh,
I believe,
all right.
I believe, with your partner.
Yes.
So you were on the Ed Sullivan Show
Yes.
several times.
Yes.
In '63 and '64.
Wow, I think we did 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah, we read that you did 4 appearances in '63 and '64.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that come about? Do you remember getting the call to be on Ed Sullivan?
Well, at the time, we were kind of unusual. We came after Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin, so we weren't a singer and a comic. We were just doing sketches. And we played at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco and the Gate of Horn, kind of hip venues at the time, the coffee houses. We'd always go in and follow the Smothers Brothers or someone. And I think word got around that we were kind of a happening team. We were very unusual. We didn't talk to the audience. We just came out and did a series of sketches with blackouts, and then good night. I know we had some ending piece. We had 2 ending pieces where I came out and very seriously said, I just want to talk to the audience. I have this very valuable letter. It's called the Lincoln Letter. My uncle had written, or my grandfather had written a letter to Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln had replied, and I had this letter, and I prepared the letter, and I said, it's very valuable, but for this audience I want to read what Mr. Lincoln said from his heart. And I'd started to read, and my partner in the background, you could hear, My partner would come up. He was a little short guy. He had a cigar. They always looked at him. He came up and he looked at me, grabbed the Lincoln letter, spit into it, threw it on the floor, and walked off. Well, the audience would laugh for 4 or 5 minutes. I would just sit there and look at him as he walked off. And I would say, good night, everyone. And that was our closing piece.
Did you have to write new material every time you appeared?
Oh, yes, we do new stuff for the Ed Sullivan Show. I don't think we went over too well.
Why not?
Because I think the show was geared more for the bang, bang, the jokes, the bang, Jackie Mason. And we did kind of a material with, I don't know, we were about the same time, or a little after Stiller and Mira, the same kind of thing. But Ed Sullivan was tough. He was, I remember one time we were on, Billy J. Kramer was a big pop star. He came after the Beatles. And Ed Sullivan would say, come out of commercial, and he'd say, are you ready for Billy J. Kramer? And the audience would scream, and at first, Greco and Willard. And then we'd have to come out. The audience was confused. Billy, are we going to introduce? And then one time we had a sketch which I thought that was our gem of our show, where I was a big league baseball player who had set a record for the most consecutive games that I had not played in. And they had me as a guest star on a charity show, and I had to come out to shake my partner's hand, and I missed his hand. And then they were going to draw the glove for the kids. And I had to put my hand in and draw out a lucky number. The kid was going to win a glove. And he took the number and he read the number out, and no one had the number. I said, that's my number. He says, well, that's an extra treat for the kids. It's this glove, and it was your number. I said, no, I'd like the glove. I really need a new glove. So we had this argument, and I forget how it went on. But it just brought huge screams from the audience. So Ed Sullivan had the Collier's Magazine All-American team on. And they preceded us, and he read off the list. For left hand from Stanford, Ed Krasuski. For left tackle from Harvard, John O'Hara. And then he got back to the fullback, Bet Barnes from UCLA. And now Greco and Willard. So we came out, and the audience was confused because they thought, are these two football players? So I think we did about half the sketch to silence. And then it kind of built up, and I was just crushed. And about 6 months later, I got hold of the tape. I said, we must have just been awful. And I watched it, and it was as funny as it could be. It just confused the audience. So I have great stories about Ed Sullivan. I remember there was some comic on, some poor guy in the rehearsal. He came out and just killed. He was so wonderful. And I heard them talk to him, and they said, Mr. Sullivan wants you to do an impression of him. And he wants you to do this, change the guy's whole act. And I remember that night he came out to silence, and he didn't score. And I remember seeing him standing in the wings, just standing with his head down, just like that. And I said, oh my God. But Ed Sullivan was the show to be on.
Did they ever do that to you? Did they ever change your material?
Yes. Yeah, my favorite story, it happened to Stiller and Mira. It didn't happen to us, but they were standing in the wings ready to go on. They were about to be introduced, and they did sketches. And the producer came up and said, we're running short. Cut 2 minutes from your sketch, which is a little tough to do. So then they changed something of ours, and they said, Ed would like to talk to you. So we went over, and Ed, this was the king. This was like going up in front of the president. Even more so, now the president, if it was Obama, hi, how are you, Brock? But back then, this is, and we had an opening, which we did in the club, where I would come out and introduce ourselves. I said, good evening, we're Greco and Willard. I'm Vic Greco. This is my partner, Fred Willard. And then he'd whisper in my ear. I said, what, is that right? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Fred Willard, and this is Vic Greco. So we did that, and the producers show Mr. Sullivan your introduction. So I did that. I'm Vic Greco. This is Fred Willard. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. I'm Fred Willard. This is Vic Greco. And Ed Sullivan looks and says, oh, okay, that's okay. Go ahead. Thinking we just made a mistake. So it was tough. It was an uphill battle. And I don't remember if doing that show helped us that much. It was more the Steve Allen show because that was our audience. We always just did great on Steve Allen, and that's where they'd get booked for these coffee houses around the country and the Hungry Eye and the more of the hip. Ed Sullivan appealed more to the big, like the Palmer House in Chicago, those big shows, you know, opening for Sarah Vaughan or something like that. So that was kind of the niche we wanted to be in and we were in.
Right. And then you, I think now I'm jumping past Second City again to the Ace Trucking Company.
Oh, yes.
Because the Ace Trucking Company you founded, and that also took you to the Tonight Show quite a bit. So
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I got home and I was doing a play, I believe, in New York, an off-Broadway play. Alan Arkin directed. Little Murders. And I got cast in that. And someone came over to see the show and they said, Fred, we're starting an improv comedy group. We'd love you to be in it. And I said, wow. And it was right down the street at the bitter end. And I said, that would be great because I still had ideas for sketches that I'd done in Chicago. So we went into this club and we would get up late at night, like midnight, after all the singers. And unless I'm wrong, I remember Neil Diamond getting up one night. We followed Neil Diamond. He obviously wasn't as big as he became. But we would do some sketches. We would do improv. And someone brought down a casting guy from The Tonight Show. And he just loved us. And we'd only been together a couple of months. And he said, all right, we have to come up with a name for your group. We'd like you to be on the show. So we didn't have a name. So everyone was suggesting names. And one of our characters, a big heavy-set guy, in one of the improvs, he did a character. His name was Tony Catucci. I'm the head truck driver for the Ace Trucking Company in Brooklyn. And we thought that was so funny. It was such a common name. Every place you go, there's an Ace typewriter, there's an Ace. And he was the Ace Trucking Company. So we all kept coming back to that. So it was that, let's call ourselves the Ace Trucking Company. So that was much more successful than my two-man team because there were 5 of us. Someone referred to us as a living cartoon. We'd come rolling out as like a live cartoon characters. We had a very heavy-set guy. We had the little guy with a mustache who did a bit called, "You doesn't have to call me Ray. You can call me Jay. You can call me RJ." And that was a big hit. And the other guy and myself were kind of straight guys, and we had a very pretty girl in the group. And we did the Tonight Show, and that led to a lot of other shows. And then we were cast to go to be on the Tom Jones variety show. And he loved us. We opened for him in Vegas, and then they took us to London to be on his TV show. And then we played clubs and colleges all over the country. We did about 50, 60 Tonight shows, and we were just on just about everything. So that was a very successful act.
Why do you think Johnny had you back so much?
We were just kind of wild. We did funny stuff. I think the guy that did the Raymond J. Johnson bit looked a lot like Doc Severinsen, so there's an inside joke there. We did a sketch about five motorcycle bikers who came into a store, and they wanted to buy. They got kind of sucked into buying very fancy, like men purses and shoes, and we kept talking about shoes. I need some shoes. So when our sketch was over, Johnny Carson was saying shoes. So they just liked us. We were just fun. We never came over to sit on the panel because there were 5 of us. But he just liked, I think, the anarchy and the fun we had.
Right. So in 1966, you were cast in a television show called Pistols and Petticoats. Do you remember that?
Sure I do.
So how did that come about?
I'm a little vague, but of course I was a new face in L.A., and someone had sent me around, and the producer liked me because I looked like the guy who'd done the role in the pilot, who wasn't available or something, and he said, I want him. I put him in the... So I did that. I got to meet Ann Sheridan, which was a big thrill. I don't think I did a scene with her, but I remember I had a lot of trouble in... first I walked with the producer out first day of shooting, and it was cloudy. And just to make conversation, I said, boy, it's nice for a change that it's cloudy. He said, well, it's not so nice when you're filming. We want sun. So I said, I started off on the wrong foot with him. Said the wrong thing. And then I had so much trouble that I'd never had before. I didn't realize. Every time I do my line, hold it, your shadow is on so-and-so's face. Oh, I didn't know. All right, you didn't hit your mark. Okay, the shadow is on, someone's shadow is on your face. And I was nuts because I suddenly realized it wasn't about acting. It was about hitting your mark, not being in someone's shadow, not looking at a certain mark. So that was a good lesson. And I said, maybe this acting thing isn't going to be that easy. Because I think as a kid, I thought it was almost in real time. You come out, the camera would capture you, go, you get on a horse, you ride away, you get off the horse. All right, that's a wrap. That led me to my next project. Someone contacted me to be in a movie called Teenage Mother. And I said I should do it because that will give me training to be on a camera, hitting my mark, not throwing a shadow on someone's face. And I played a baseball coach in a high school. And there was a scene where I was walking the kids back. And in the high school, they'd hired this sexy Swedish teacher who she was going to teach, I think, biology to the kids. And she was really sexy. And it was the movie, the selling point of the movie, they're going to show a live birth on television, an exploitation film. So some of these teenage tough guys had pulled this biology teacher, I won't tell you what is on their mind, into the boiler room, and they were going to have sex with her, and they were going to, they were attacking her. And I'm walking down the hall with the guys tossing a baseball probably, and what's that? Screams from the boiler room. And I burst into the boiler room and stop right there, and I pull them off and save her, and I forget what the rest of the plot is. So I never heard anything about the movie. A year later, my wife and I were in New York, and I saw it was playing in Staten Island. So I said, we got to go down to Staten Island to see the movie, Teenage Mother. So we took the Staten Island ferry. We got directions to the theater. And when my scene came up and they were pulling the dress off this poor woman, and I come bursting in the boiler room, stop right there, and the audience booed me because they didn't want me to stop this scene. So that was another lesson. But I didn't have any trouble hitting my marks or throwing shadows on anyone's face.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's a step in the right direction. You were also on Get Smart in 1968.
Yes. Now, that was with my original partner. They'd seen us do, we did a pantomime bit where he was a safecracker and I was the cop that came in. And I'd gotten the idea from seeing these movies, cowboy movies, where someone has the draw on the other guy and the other guy kicks the gun out of his hand. And I actually saw where they did that a couple of times. And I said, how do they get so close with the gun and that you could knock it out of your hand? So we did this scene that we carried it to extreme where they just kept kicking the gun out of each other's hand and the other, and it went on and on and on, and finally they lost the gun, and the detective just gets up and leaves, and the safecracker goes back to cracking the safe. So someone saw that and put us on as two rookie detectives who were going to demonstrate, the technique of stopping a safe robbery. And the interesting thing about that, we did it, and our agent, I came in one day and to his office, and my partner said they wanted to use that as a pilot for our own series. I said, oh, that's great. He said, but we've turned it down. I guess my agent said, you're not going to use this as a pilot. I think we got paid $800 you're not going to use this as a pilot without paying my boy. So, of course, we didn't do the pilot. That was our agent, stepping in. He stepped in more than once to do something like that for us.
Were you disappointed when you heard that?
Absolutely. And I said, I knew this was wrong. I said, this is wrong. But, I don't know how young we were. We were in our middle 20s. And we thought, well, and that happened some other times, too. I think we were supposed to be on a TV show called Hootenanny, which was very hip at the time. And this show, Woody Allen was going to host it. And they wanted us to come on. It was at some college. I went in. I said, great. And our manager said, no, we're not going to do it because you're doing the Ed Sullivan Show, and they don't want you to do another show 3 months before or 1 month after the show. I said, but it won't fall into that. It's not a month after. He said, yeah, but we just don't want to make them angry. So we didn't do this very prestigious Hootenanny show. I just remember, I don't know what it is, I came in another time, my partner was sitting there, and he says, we just got an offer to be on a sketch show called Crack Nuts. I said, great. He says, but we've turned it down. So there were some tough times there. The audiences were fine, but our manager was that was a tough crowd, the manager and the agent.
One show you did... Okay. One show that you were on was the Mike Douglas Show in 1972, which was the week that John Lennon and Yoko Ono were hosting. Can you
Yes.
tell us about that?
That was an interesting experience. We used to go down to do the Mike Douglas Show every few months. And it was really great. We'd take a train down, do the show, take a train home. This time it was John Lennon and Yoko, and Bobby Seale, the Black Panthers, were there. I don't think they were on the show. And we came down, and we were waiting, and everything was delayed. And suddenly the producer came down. They said, we want to see your sketch, what you're going to do, written out. We want to okay the sketch, because there was a lot of political stuff around the show. We never did political humor. So we said, we don't want to write out our sketch. We never did that. It was all in our minds. And we had a new manager at the time who brought us down there. And he was up in the lobby making phone calls. This was before the days of cell phones. He was up in the lobby making phone calls. And it got later and later. And finally we said, to hell with it. We're going to miss our train. Let's not do the show. So just then our manager came down and says, how's it going, guys? And my partner, who was kind of in charge of the group, says, we're walking. He says, what? We're walking. We're going to miss the train. What do you mean you're going to miss the train? You're going to do the show. So they went upstairs and they came down. The producers, okay, we don't have to see the written material. We trust you guys. So we got up and we did the show. And the one guy who did you doesn't have to call me Ray, you can call me Jay. It was kind of like the old Amos and Andy sketch. And he was very nervous because Bobby Seale and some of the Black Panthers were there. Thought they might take offense that we're making fun of a black character. But Bobby Seale and them laughed. I mean, they just loved it. The show went great. I've since seen the show. There's a long version and a short version. The long version they keep in the you doesn't have to call me Ray, and the others they leave it out. But it went well, and I forget whether we had any interplay with John and Yoko. I'm sure we did. Hello, how are you? But it was an interesting show because we'd done it with Bobby Darin, and I remember Bobby Darin doing an improv with us, and so we had a lot of fun doing that. But that was a very well-remembered show.
Absolutely. Historic. In 1975, you were on the Bob Newhart Show. And do you remember who you played? You were Ellen's fiancé.
Yes. I hadn't been working, and they called me in to read for the part of a guy, Bob's sister's old boyfriend. And the character was, the reference to him was that he lived in Cleveland, but how could he have a year-round tan if he lived in Cleveland? I was really a hip guy with wearing leather. And I said, I should play this character. I think I told him, I'm from Cleveland. So I went in and I read for it, and they hemmed and hawed, and they finally called me, okay, Fred, you got the part. So I remember stopping at a payphone, calling my wife, and I said, well, I got the part. And she said, well, it's about time. So I was a big fan of the show, and I did it, and I've since seen it, and it's very funny. As a matter of fact, I did the commentary on it for the CD or the DVD when it was put out. And Bob Newhart is really a charming guy. For some reason, he really liked me. He invited me when he got the Kennedy Center Honors to come and speak, which, I mean, he knows so many people that he asked me. I kept saying, why is he asking me? But he's so charming, and he would invite us up for drinks, and all he would do is thank us. I remember the Smothers Brothers were there, and me, and he would say, thanks so much for doing this, and I was just so flattered to do it. So that was, yes, the Bob Newhart Show.
Excellent. In 1976, you were on a show called Sirota's Court.
Indeed, I was. And it was a wonderful show. I played the public...
You were the district attorney.
The district attorney. Kind of a clueless guy. I was a buffoon. I had some very funny scenes. Unfortunately, as the story of so many shows, after we did the pilot, there's a change of people, I think it was Universal or some network, they decided that they didn't want to put on the show. They would put it on. They put on our show. I remember them putting it on after a Donnie and Marie, or opposite a Donnie Marie Christmas special. And I said, gee, I want to watch the Donnie and Marie Christmas special. We didn't have TiVo then, so I think I watched the Donnie and Marie Christmas special and then watched our show at another time. So it wasn't popular, but shortly thereafter they put on Night Court, which is quite an exact replica of Sorota's Court. And they used some of the plots and the same characters. So that was a wonderful show, though I had a whole lot of fun doing it.
At that point in your career, were you looking to become a regular on a TV series? Was that your goal?
Sure. I don't think I knew what I wanted to be. If a job came along, I would say, yeah, that is it. And I like the part. I've seen it now, and I was really terrific on it. I had some scene where I had been caught smoking marijuana, and I was on trial, and I said I want to prosecute myself and defend myself. So I stood, and I would sit and be myself and stand and sit. It was a very funny scene. Michael Constantine was the judge. It was a very good series, but as so many series, everyone who's done a series that hasn't been successful has a story. They changed the time slot, they changed the day, they buried it. So this is one of those cases.
Right. So not long after that, though, you signed on to Fernwood Tonight. So how do you go from Sorota's Court to Fernwood Tonight?
I got a call to go in to see the people who were doing this show called Fernwood Tonight. And whoever called me said they want you to be the host. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because at Second City we'd done a show about an amateur hour, where I was the host of a show called The Amateur Hour, and all these awful amateurs came on. One of them played a musical broom, and one of them had a catatonic fit on the show. And I said, that's right down my alley. And meanwhile, I'd done a pilot for a show called Space Patrol or something. I was a spoof on Star Trek and those shows. So I thought, I was the star of that. I said, gee, I'll be a star of a sitcom. That'll be great. So they called me in. They said, no, you're not going to be the host. You're going to be the co-host. You're going to be like the Ed McMahon. And I said, gee, I'm not quite right for that. They said, Martin Mull is going to be the host. I said, oh, God, he's great. I just seen him in a club. I said, but to be the Ed McMahon, I started listing other people who would be good for it. And they said, no, don't list other people. Everyone thinks you'll be just right for it. And I said, I don't know. I've done this pilot for this this space spoof. And they said, well, again, they said, would you just come in for a week while we do run-throughs until we find someone who'll be right for it? I said, okay, sure. So I went in, and I found it so hip, and I just fell in love with Martin Mull. He had such a sharp sense of humor that after about 4 or 5 days, I went up to them, and I said, guys, I think I'd like to do this. I mean, it was much... I wasn't the Ed McMahon. As Martin Mull pointed out several times, it was not a spoof of The Tonight Show, because that would last about one night. What it was is a show, a cable show that came on in this little town of Fernwood, where Mary Hartman was done, and someone wondered what it would be like if they had their own cable talk show. So we did it, and the first night, I would sit next to Martin, and then they'd move me down as the guests came on, and I would sit further and further down. And Norman Lear wanted it to be like a one-camera show, that when it came time for the guest to speak, they'd set the camera on him, and it was my turn, the camera on the third person. And one of the producers, who was Alan Thicke, a lot of people don't know that, said, Norman, we can't do that. It would take forever. Just make it like a talk show. So Alan said, well, okay, do what you want. So I think Martin and I clicked so well that they redid the first show. They said, let's leave Fred sitting next to Martin. So this crazy interplay. So we did the whole season, and I thought nothing of it. We had a little tiny audience there, and we'd done about 13 of them, maybe 26, and then they sent us out to promote it. And I remember I got into a cab in Chicago, and I said, I'm going up to Michigan and Ohio. And the guy looked around, he says, you're that guy Jerry Hubbard on Fernwood Tonight. I had no idea how popular it had become. So as we went out to promote it, people would just gather around, and they loved it. And I came back, and I would say to Norman Lear and Al Burton, who was the producer, I said, "You guys don't realize how popular this show is." And they said, "Oh, yes, we do." I said, "No, you don't. I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of people." And in Detroit and Dallas, it came over a main station, so it was terrifically popular. So meanwhile, all of Norman Lear's friends, celebrity friends, fell in love with it and kept calling and said, "I've got to be on this." Carol Burnett, Charlton Heston, Burt Lancaster. So they said, "Let's do another season." It was just supposed to be one season. But how are we going to explain all these celebrities are in this little town called Fernwood, Ohio? Let's move it to a town called Altacoma, California, the unfinished furniture capital of America. So these celebrities could be driving through, going to Carmel or San Francisco. So I think the high point of my whole 2 years was having Burt Lancaster come on. We had a news conference. This wasn't part of it. It was called America Tonight. And I had to introduce Burt Lancaster, and he was my idol. And he came out just so, with his hair and his jacket. And I said, well, our guest is Burt Lancaster, star of Birdman of Alcatraz, star of Captain so-and-so. Captain, give me a straight introduction. Finally, I said, "And I'm sorry, Mr. Lancaster, I didn't have time to memorize all your credits that you gave me." And he looked at me and he came over and he just picked me up like that and put me down. And I just always remember that. My idol, and I made him laugh. And then another high point, Charlton Heston came on. Now, a lot of these celebrities didn't want to come for rehearsal. So the thing was they were going to ask Charlton Heston about his early life. Do you remember your first prom? And my character was going to interrupt him. Boy, I remember my first prom. I went with Sydney and Charlton Heston would just give me kind of a dirty look. And this went on and on. Charlton, do you remember when you met the woman you married? I remember I met the woman. And finally we sent him out we wanted a soft drink. Charlton, would you go out? There's a soft drink machine. Oh yeah, thanks. And he left and he never came back. So the show was over. Norman Lear was there, and I thought, oh my God, he must hate me, because he had no idea what was coming. So I went to Norman Lear. I said, "Was Charlton Heston mad?" He said, "No, he loved it. He caught on to the whole thing." And so that was always great. You forgot that they were actors.
So in the case like the Charlton Heston case, what did he know? You said that he knew you were going to talk about his first prom. Was there a script, or was it just the topic?
I don't know if he even knew that. A lot of them would say, "Just do anything you want. I'll go with it." Well, I'm going to ask you about maybe they deliberately didn't tell him I was going to do that, or maybe they did, and he was just he was an actor. So that was a lot of fun.
Was the show scripted at all, or
yes,
was it?
The show was completely scripted, and after a while I would say, "What if I say this here?" And they'd say, "Well, go ahead and try it." And after a while I realized they taped about 45 minutes for a 25-minute show. After a while I realized that I said I could say anything I want, and if it doesn't work, they'll cut it. So then we got freer and freer, and Martin and I would ad-lib, and certain people came on. Kenny Mars came on with a wonderful character. Several of them came on with their own material, and we would feel free to improvise, and we'd just go on and on. And others were actors they were scripted, and you could tell that they didn't want to go off the script too much, because we only had one run-through. We'd run through it once, and the director would say, "Okay, be back at 4 o'clock for a taping." They'd say, "That's it?" And there was no cue cards. The only one who had a cue card was Martin Mull. So the most fun we would have was the improvisation.
And did a lot of the improv end up making it to the show,
yeah,
like when you were in a groove?
And I look back now, and I can't remember what we made up and what was scripted, because it all kind of mashed up. And I found one thing. I said, Martin Mull, I said, you cannot top him. I would toss a joke in and he'd top it. I said, he's untoppable. You got to stay on your toes with him. And we had a lot of great guests. Tom Waits, everyone seems to remember Tom Waits.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you specifically about that.
Uh-huh.
What's your memory of him being on the show?
I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy. I'm not even sure that was his line, but it was memorable. Everyone loved that. Robert Conrad came on. He was a tough guy then. And we did something. We gave him something that put him to sleep. And he had a commercial at the time where he had a chip on his shoulder, knocked that chip off my shoulder. And I started making fun of him deliberately because I knew he was supposed to be asleep on the couch, and I knew he was dying to get up, and I could just see him just stir like that. And Carol Burnett, we brought on, Happy Kind, that was Frank Duvall, the band leader, had met her, and she was going to be a big surprise guest. And he made us get blindfold, and wait till you find out who we have as this guest. And Carol Burnett came on. It was like, what's that show where you had to guess what's my line? Yeah. And so she started talking. I'm a comedian, and we couldn't guess who she was, and we couldn't guess, and she got madder and madder. So finally, we took off our blindfolds, and we looked at her, and we still kept guessing. And I think she walked off the show too, but that was all planned. That was another high point.
That's amazing. You mentioned Happy Kind.
Frank Duvall.
Yeah, so tell me about him. He had a career far beyond being on the show.
I had no idea who Frank Duvall was. I had no idea who those musicians were. Martin did, because he was a musician. But one day someone said to me, hey, you have so-and-so playing the bass guitar. How do you know that? Oh, I could just hear it. These were all well-known, well-respected musicians. I didn't know anything about Frank Duvall's career, what he'd written, what he'd done. I found out he'd written a song called Hey, Look at Me. I forget the name of it, but I had actually bought the record. It was done by the
Sorry, I can't help you out on that one.
Not the Shirelles. The very popular three-women group.
Supremes?
The Supremes. Yes. And I had the record. I kept saying, Frank, I got that record. You wrote that? He said, yeah. So we became good friends. He was a very sweet man. He knew Neil Hefti. He'd invite us over to his house, and Neil Hefti would be there. He was really great and very well respected and very comical. He loved to do comic bits on the show. And I understand how he got on the show. He called Norman Lear. He says, you're going to need a band leader, and I want to be it. And Norman said, well, look, we're talking to this one, that one. And Frank said, no, it's got to be me. So he was on the show, and he became a big part of it.
Wow. Was Norman Lear heavily involved with the series?
No. We would see him at the beginning. Alan Thicke was the hands-on stage director. We would have a director who'd be up in the booth. And for years, I'd run into people who'd come up and say, I was the director on a couple of those shows, and I didn't know who it was, because they were just, camera one, camera two. But Alan Thicke was the hands-on director. He'd come down and talk to us. And I remember the big argument at the time. There was the Gong Show on, and occasionally they'd have a guest come on who was on the Gong Show. And Martin Mull would get very angry about that. He says, no, we don't want people from the Gong Show. People should believe this is a real show coming from Fernwood, Ohio, that these are just characters that come on the show. So that was the big artistic discussion.
Did you have an issue with that?
No, I agreed with him. I said, no, that's the best thing. This should be as real as possible. But, if they had someone on, I was too kind of new to the thing to be too vocal about. One thing I didn't want to do, they would have me do real commercials. And I said, I don't think this character, Jerry Hubbard, would suddenly get and do real, now for just 30 days, you can buy. And the next day they had me do it again. I got up, jumped out of my seat, went up to the control booth. I said, look, I just don't want to do these. And then they changed it because I wanted to be in that same character through the whole show.
Right. We're going to stop and change tapes,
Good.
and then we'll talk more about